The medieval country of Rus was initially founded as a number of trading posts, from whence the region was terrorized by Vikings seeking tribute. These warriors and tradesmen operated in an almost nomadic manner from their boats. Over the decades and centuries, these posts expanded into towns and united to form a single polity. The 10th century especially saw skyrocketing urbanization and foreign treaties being signed to solidify peaceful trade. The regency of Olga, between 945 and 956, was spent consolidating the scattered possessions, establishing foreign relations, and stabilizing domestic affairs and the collection of tribute. All of this was done to hand the crown over to Olga's son, Sviatoslav. And though the days of an aggressive Viking Rus were nearing their end, he would lead the Old Guard on a final hurrah. A non-stop series of violent campaigns against his neighbors, destroying an empire, subjugating tribes and nations, and nearly bringing down the remnants of Rome. His descendants would bow down before the cross and be ushered in his baptismal waters. Sviatoslav was the final pagan, a staunch believer in Perun and Volos, and certainly lived up to their heathen creed. As I've discussed in previous episodes, it is uncertain when Sviatoslav was born. Traditional accounts suggest 943, but this has been disputed. According to the primary Chronicle, Sviatoslav was able to lead an army and throw a spear in 946, even if he did so poorly, leading one to believe that he must have been at least a young teenager at this point. According to the Chronicle, he became mature and ascended to the throne in 956, meaning he would have been 13, according to conventional sources. It seems believable, but some issues begin to arise. Sviatoslav would have 3 sons, Yaropolk, Vladimir, and Oleg. It is alleged that Yaropolk and Vladimir were born in 958 to different mothers. Vladimir's was a housekeeper named Malusha. If they were born in that year, they must have been conceived when Sviatoslav was 14 or 15. Teenage pregnancies and affairs of this sort are certainly not unheard of, nor is it certain how much of a scandal it would have aroused in medieval Rus, or even how common it was. But it does seem a bit iffy, without raising a discussion about medieval views on premarital and teenage relations. There is also the age of Olga, his mother. I've previously theorized that, based on her age, that Sviatoslav might have been born earlier, perhaps in the early to mid-930s. This would make the legend of him leading an army in 946 and him conceiving his sons in 958 make a bit more sense. So I think he was born sometime between 930 and 940. It is possible that Olga wasn't regent during the full period between 945 and 956, perhaps only during the first few years, after which she might have been a joint ruler alongside of her son. A joint rulership was a tradition among the Rus and the neighboring empires which they emulated, Khazaria and the Byzantines. It can also be evidenced in pendants issued to Rus officials. These would often carry 2 symbols, one representing the monarch and another representing the co-monarch. This was obviously in play between Olga and Sviatoslav. There is a finding of a bone plate, carrying on one side a bident, Sviatoslav's symbol. On the other is a bident with a cross above it, Olga's symbol. She was a Christian, whereas Sviatoslav was pagan. During Olga's regency, she issued pendants having a bident with a key above, a symbol of her being the regent, and a falcon, a symbol of motherhood. Historians agree that Olga was the co-ruler of Sviatoslav, and that she governed his dominions when he was away on campaigns after 962. But I think it is possible that Sviatoslav became an adult and ascended to the throne much earlier, and that the co-rulership also began earlier, perhaps in the early to mid-950s. Sviatoslav may have been at peace for several years before campaigning against the Khazars in 962. The Chronicle portrays this attack as kind of occurring on a whim, whereas other sources tell us that the Khazarian subjects invited Sviatoslav to intervene in their rebellion. More on this in a bit. A Byzantine source, De Administrando Imperio, written between 948 and 952, informs us that Sviatoslav spent his early years in the city of Novgorod, far from the capital, in Kiev. Novgorod was an older settlement than Kiev and had about as much power and influence. Being so far away from Kiev, it was regarded as a second capital. It would later become an independent, powerful republic. So it seems that during Sviatoslav's childhood and early reign, he governed in Novgorod, whereas Olga governed in Kiev. Sviatoslav was the son of Igor, king of the Rus. When seeking to extract a second tribute from the Drevlians, a vassal tribe, Igor was torn to pieces. Olga embarked on a campaign of vengeance, culminating in a military assault in 946, led by Sviatoslav and his two confidants, Asmund, his tutor, and Svenald, the commander. According to legend, the opposing armies lined up for battle, and Sviatoslav cast his spear against them. But being but a child, the spear barely made it past the ears of his horse. Nonetheless, Asmund and Svenald said, "The prince has already begun battle. Press on, vassals, after the prince," and they won the day. This anecdote was most likely shared to show Sviatoslav's eagerness for battle, even at a young age. His actual presence in the battle can be debated upon, depending on what his age might have been. A young teenager might have been more actively present, whereas an actual child would definitely have been more of a figurehead. The rest of the regency was spent at peace. Olga converted to Christianity and attempted to induct her son as well. Sviatoslav declined, believing his followers would ridicule him for it. Olga countered by saying that if he converted, they would do the same. Still, he remained a pagan and would be for the rest of his life. One of the most hotly debated controversies of the Rus regards their affinity to the Scandinavian and Slavic peoples. It is generally believed in academia that the Rus prior to this point had been predominantly Scandinavian, but that it began to change with the reign of Sviatoslav. However, it is difficult to attribute Sviatoslav to one single culture. For one, his name is Slavic, and according to the primary chronicle, he worshipped the Slavic gods, Perun and Volos. However, his tutor and close confidant in Novgorod and abroad, Asmund, was a Norseman. So Sviatoslav must have been at least bilingual. De Administrando Imperio corroborates the idea of Norse being the dominant language of the Rus elite during the reign of Sviatoslav, as it provides place names both in the Slavic language and the Rus language. The names in the Rus language are clearly Scandinavian, such as Eifur and Holmfors. Unlike other rulers of the period, we do have descriptions of what Sviatoslav behaved and looked like. His years of campaigning against and together with horse nomads inspired him to adapt their aesthetics, customs, and tactics. The Chronicle tells the following. Upon his expeditions he carried with him neither wagons nor kettles, and boiled no meat, but cut off small strips of horseflesh, game, or beef, and ate it after roasting it on the coals. Nor did he have a tent, but he spread out a horse blanket under him, and set his saddle under his head. This account is compatible with a Byzantine eyewitness description from 971. He wore a plain white garment, different from those of the others only in its cleanliness, and a bejeweled gold ring in one ear, while his scalp was shaven, save for a long strand of hair, displaying the nobility of his kin. This description was, however, given much later in Sviatoslav's life, and may not correspond to what he looked like at the beginning of his reign. Perhaps he adopted this look after years of campaigning upon the steppe, although he is almost exclusively portrayed in this manner. Nevertheless, the description corresponds with the tactics and life he lived in the early parts of his reign, so it isn't unfeasible that he assumed this look early on. A similar hairstyle was used in the 10th century by Hungarian and Bulgarian warriors, and probably also by the Turkic nomads. In later centuries, it was a sign of nobility among certain tribes, and it would famously be adopted by the Cossacks. Either way, Sviatoslav's Norse rearing, his adherence to the Slavic gods, and his nomadic lifestyle treads in line with a modern scholarly consensus, which sees the early Rus as a melting pot of different cultures. Rus was an empire of trade. They depended on collecting tribute in the form of furs and other materials, which were exported to the Mediterranean and Middle East in return for silver. However, to trade in the region, the Rus were dependent on the Khazar Khaganate as a middleman between the north and south. The Rus looked up to the Khazars, adapting their titles, customs, and aesthetics. But in the early 10th century, their relationship began to sour. Igor and Oleg had waged war upon the Khazars, but never managed to best them. The Rus were ambitious and wanted to expand their commercial interests in the Middle East, an interest which the Khazars were now blocking. There was only enough space for one trade lord in the region, and a showdown was imminent. Especially important for trade was the Crimean Peninsula. In the 10th century, it was divided between the Byzantines and Khazars. In 960, the Byzantines were distracted by expeditions against Islam, allowing for a Khazar incursion attempting to reassert control over the Gothic subjects. The Goths had Scandinavian roots, much like the Rus, having moved from the north during the migration era. They moved through modern Poland, Ukraine, and Romania, with most of them settling down in Italy and Spain. However, some decided to stay in Crimea, and would remain a substantial minority until as far as the 20th century. The Khazar occupation was brutal, leading to the destruction of villages and cities. The Goths turned to Sviatoslav for assistance. It is not unlikely that the common Nordic heritage would have facilitated this building of relations. The Norsemen were able to build close ties with the Anglo-Saxons, and despite common conception, most of the Norsemen in England were not raiders but agricultural settlers, who assimilated into local culture within the span of 100 years. Language would not have been the biggest barrier, but religion. The Goths were Orthodox Christian at this point, and it isn't certain if they would have maintained Germanic legends, especially those from the migration era. Even though Scandinavia is commonly believed to have been isolated from the fall of Rome, figures like Attila appear in Norse legend. There was a shared mythos between the ones who stayed and the ones who migrated. The connection between the Rus and Goths is poorly documented, but one which has a lot of potential for research and discussion. But it can't be tackled any further in a video on Sviatoslav. All we know is that he accepted the Gothic plea for help. Of course, as we know, all he needed was a reason. The Khazars and Rus were competing over trade and tributaries. The Gothic delegation arrived in August and left in January the following year. When spring came and the ice broke, Sviatoslav set sail. Sviatoslav's campaign most likely followed the pattern of the Rus trading expeditions to the east. Starting in Novgorod, he moved down the rivers to the city of Kiev, collecting vassal forces along the way and organizing the final army in the capital. Next, they moved by boat down the Dnipro into the Black Sea, around Crimea, into the Sea of Azov, and up the Don. His first target was most likely Samkarch, the gateway to the east. Sviatoslav had picked the most opportune moment to strike. Khazaria had been weakened by a recent nomadic incursion, most likely by the Oghuz and Pechenegs. They attacked in the winter of 964-965, when the rivers of Khazaria were frozen, allowing the hordes to cross. By late winter, the nomads had been defeated. They no doubt desired vengeance, and would prove an eager ally. The nomad attack spurred the Khazars to request aid from a neighbor across the Caspian, Khwarezm. Though the Khwarezmians humored the Khazars, they demanded a conversion to Islam. The Khagan was desperate and agreed. Khazaria had previously converted to Judaism, turning them into a third power bloc independent of Christian Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate. But the 10th century had made it clear that this wasn't functional. Though Khazaria was an impressive empire, it just wasn't strong enough, and religious disputes, hostile neighbors, and climate change brought them to the brink of collapse. They had to pick a side, and over the decades grew closer to Islam. In the 950s, the Pagan wrote that he was the only barrier keeping the Rus from sailing into the Caliphate and ransacking all the way to the gates of Baghdad. Though the Rus had launched a number of raiding expeditions into the Caliphate in the 10th century, the Pagan's letter was certainly a scare tactic to get more support. It wasn't enough, he was desperate, and in the winter of 965, he converted to Islam. This decision marked Byzantium as a firm opponent of Khazaria. In the last 2 centuries, the two empires had been friends, allies, but in the 10th century it had degraded into a sort of Cold War. Both sides tried using the Rus as a proxy against the other. But the conversion to Islam, the religion of Byzantium's biggest enemy, forced the Romans to take an actively hostile stance against them. Thus, Sviatoslav would have full Byzantine support in his endeavors against Khazaria. Therefore, Sviatoslav launched his attack in 965 at the perfect moment. He had a righteous cause, protect the Goths. A long-standing economic and political rivalry, winning him the support of his vassals and merchants. The Khazars were weakened. He had Ogush and Pecheneg allies, eager for vengeance. He had Byzantine support, and the ice had just broken, literally and figuratively. One can only imagine that he had waited for this opportunity ever since leaving Regency. He is often portrayed as a hothead, and this would prove otherwise. Perhaps he was tempered by Olga, his co-ruler and mother. His first target was most definitely the fortress of Samkarch, also known as Tmutarakan. Seated upon the tip of the Taman Peninsula, one of the most densely settled areas of the Khazar Khaganate, it protected entry from the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov, and the River Don, which led to the Volga and the Caspian, and the trade route of the Middle East. It was a vital strategic point, and had been sacked 20 years prior by Oleg. Archaeology reveals a conflagration layer in the mid-10th century. The Khazars had now heard of his advance, and the Pagan himself mustered an army to meet them. This was exceptional, since military command was usually left to the Bek, the man in charge of the army and politics of Khazaria, whereas the Pagan was a spiritual figurehead. Little is known about the engagement, but Sviatoslav was victorious. After taking Samkarch and defeating the Khazars, the way had been opened up the River Don all the way to Sarkel, the White Fortress. This structure had been built with Byzantine assistance to strengthen the Khazarian border and protect the heartland against nomadic incursions. Sviatoslav conquered the fortress, renaming it Belavesha. Symbols of Sviatoslav and Olga have been discovered in the ruins. One is an ivory plate bearing his bident. It can also be found on a piece of amphora. Another amphora has Olga's symbol, the bident with the cross above it. With Sarkel having fallen into Sviatoslav's hands, and the Pagan's army bested by the coalition of nomads and Rus, Khazaria was helpless. Sviatoslav acted swiftly, using divide and conquer. Riding south, he quickly subjugated the Alans and Circassians, vassal tribes of the Khazars. Returning to Sarkel and using it as a base, he subjugated the Viatichians, a Slavic tribe that had been paying tribute to the Khazars. Interestingly, in the form of silver instead of furs. His next campaign was against the cities of Khazaria, situated on the Caspian coast. He began with the city of Atil, built on the mouth of the Volga River. Ibn Haukala wrote the following of its destruction. At the present time, the Rus have left nothing to the Bulgar, Burtas, and Khazars but a few worthless ruins. They fell upon them and looted everything, obtaining in their territories more than they could have hoped for. The onslaught pressed further south to the city of Samandar, a flourishing trade port that had once been the capital of Khazaria and housed a wealthy and cosmopolitan populace. It was famous for its gardens and vineyards, and Ibn Hawqal wrote the following: "There is not enough left of a vineyard or garden worth giving to a beggar. If a leaf were left on a branch, one of the Rus would carry it off. Not a grape, not a raisin remains in that country." Having crushed the Khazar Khaganate, Sviatoslav moved against their final subjects. He crushed the Burtas and marched next upon Volga, Bulgaria. He conquered the capital of Bolgar at the junction of the Kama and Volga. However, Volga, Bulgaria would continue as a prosperous dominion and trade partner of the Rus, sometimes a powerful adversary, so it is likely that Sviatoslav came to an agreement with them. The Bulgars were Muslims and had strong connections to the traders of the south and east, and had replaced Khazaria as the silver bridge between the Rus and Muslims in the previous decades. Thus, it was more valuable to keep them alive and partnered, rather than to start from the beginning. The Bulgars were a middleman, but more manageable than the Khazars. After almost 400 years of dominating the steppe, Khazaria had fallen. This long-standing adversary of Byzantium had fallen, and Constantinople rejoiced. Some believe that the fall of Khazaria had been entirely organized by the Byzantines, and whilst their scheming certainly had a role in the downfall, it mustn't be ignored that Sviatoslav and his court had an economic and political interest in conquering the Khaganate, and were also contacted by the Crimean Goths. It is quite telling that the Goths went to Kiev instead of Constantinople, despite the latter having possessions in Crimea. Either way, the Byzantines now considered Sviatoslav an asset. Still waging a distant war against the Arabs, they were facing troubles on the home front: the neighboring Magyars and Bulgarians. The emperor sent an emissary, Kalokhiras, to ask for Sviatoslav's assistance. The deal was sweetened with 1,500 pounds of gold. The scheming Kalokhiras had ambitions of his own. He wanted Sviatoslav to back him in his bid for the crown. In 968, Sviatoslav sailed to Bulgaria, and rowing up the Danube, his army conquered as many as 80 of their towns. He established a base of operations in Pereiaslavets, and began to collect revenue from the Danube. Now, this powerful, insatiable warlord, bribed by the Byzantines to fix their Bulgarian problem, was becoming a problem in and of himself, and they had to pay him a regular tribute to keep him satisfied. This was part and parcel of Byzantine politics, and they had no particular attachment to any of their quote-unquote allies, who were more so considered temporary assets. This can be observed in De Administrando Imperio, where all of their neighbors, the Rus, Pechenegs, Khazars, Bulgarians, are primarily discussed from what enemies they have, and how these can be instigated against one another. Thus, Sviatoslav's previous ally, the Pechenegs, who had assisted him in toppling Khazaria, suddenly attacked the Rus heartland, laying siege to the capital of Kiev. Suspicious, isn't it? Olga and the sons of Sviatoslav were stuck inside of the walls, and Sviatoslav quickly had to uplift his army from the Danube and lift the siege of Kiev. The Pechenegs retreated into the steppe, but he hadn't seen the last of them. After lifting the siege, Sviatoslav had no intentions of staying. However, Olga was dying and begged him to remain in her final moments. A couple of days later, Olga passed away. Sviatoslav divided his possessions among his sons, leaving them to administer it for him, as he rode out again, eager for the riches of the Danube. Before departing Kiev, Sviatoslav announced his reasons for returning to the Danube. "I do not care to remain in Kiev, but should prefer to live in Pereiaslavets on the Danube, since that is the center of my realm, where all riches are concentrated. Gold, silks, wine, and various fruits from Greece, silver and horses from Hungary and Bohemia, and from Rus furs, wax, honey, and slaves. Thus, Sviatoslav truly represented the final generation of warlike, nomadic Rus, who cared little for land and possessions, only for war and trade. They moved to wherever the commerce was the most lucrative. At this moment, it was upon the Danube. After the Hungarians were defeated by Otto I, and missionary work pacified the Carpathian Basin, trade upon the Danube had flourished. As Sviatoslav had allegedly said, Perun might have been a more suitable capital than Kiev on the Dnipro, which had only really been occupied by the Rus because it was more advantageous for the trade with Khazaria and Byzantium. The historical implications here are fascinating. Had Sviatoslav succeeded in his ambitions, the history of Rus and its descendants might have looked entirely different. But it wasn't to be. In the summer of 969, Sviatoslav returned and laid siege to Perun. The Bulgarians sallied out, but Sviatoslav rallied his men and defeated the enemy. The Rus warriors were now accompanied by women, implying that they were planning on a permanent settlement. As for the Bulgarians, he used both carrot and stick to subjugate them. The Bulgarian ruler, Boris II, was allowed to remain in Pereslav as a puppet, winning the support of many Bulgarians. As for the resistance, the Chronicle claimed that the Russes impaled 20,000 captives. The slaughter must have been staggering, but in all likelihood, the number was exaggerated. I can imagine that there were far fewer, something like 2,000 or even just 200. Even still, it would have been an act of utmost brutality. Meanwhile, Sviatoslav signed treaties with other neighbors. The Oghuz and Pechenegs joined him once more, as did a number of Hungarians. Thus, Sviatoslav displayed a terrifying mixture of military excellence, diplomacy, and brutality. He was laying the foundations for a new order, centered around the trade of the Danube, its riches harvested by his Bulgarian puppets, protected by his nomadic allies, and enjoyed by him and the Rus. The final adversary was Byzantium. In the spring of 970, Sviatoslav declared war upon the empire. He marched his army across the Haemus mountains and seized the city of Adrianople, not far from Constantinople itself. It is unlikely that he was planning any campaign of conquest. He was deep in Byzantine territory, and claiming permanent possessions would have been difficult without taking Constantinople itself. Without a significant siege train, this would have been impossible. Instead, much like his predecessors, Sviatoslav was likely looking to elicit a favorable treaty from the Byzantines. However, whilst they could tolerate a few barbarians blockading their city and sacking some nearby villages to force a trade pact, they couldn't accept a hostile occupation right next to, let alone within their borders. There was nothing saying that if, say, the Arabs would invade Anatolia, Sviatoslav wouldn't move in and devastate the imperial provinces. Some chroniclers even thought that he wanted to take Constantinople itself. Furthermore, the previous emperor, perhaps more compliant, Nikephoros Phokas, had just been assassinated, and his successor, John Tzimiskes, attempted to make deals with the savages to no avail. He spent the next year training an army of special troops, and in 970 defeated Sviatoslav at the gates of Arkadiopolis. However, he did not press his advantage. Sviatoslav retreated back into Bulgaria, not thinking the Byzantines would follow him. He did not post any garrisons in the southern cities and had no sentries in the mountain passes. Thus, in the spring of 970, the Byzantine army was able to cross into Bulgaria unimpeded. Tzimiskes' elite cavalry was able to launch a lightning strike on the Bulgarian capital of Preslav. And despite fierce resistance from the Rus commander, the city was taken. Crucially, King Boris II of Bulgaria, Sviatoslav's puppet, had been captured and was dragged off in chains to Constantinople. Sviatoslav was enraged. This would cost him the loyalty of his Bulgarian subjects. In a paranoid episode, he executed 300 Bulgarian nobles whom he suspected of disloyalty, hoping to make a point to the rest. As the Byzantines marched upon him, he felt confident that his shield wall of Rus warriors, supported by Pechenegs and Magyar cavalry, would be able to defeat the enemy. But as the Byzantines closed in, the nomads deserted him. They had been bribed by the Byzantines. Sviatoslav mounted his infantry on horses and led them in a disastrous charge. Apparently, only 3 Byzantine horses were killed, compared to staggering losses among the Rus. Meanwhile, the imperial fleet moved up the river, blocking any escape back to Kiev, and stopping the flow of food into the beleaguered fortress. The situation was grim, and though defeat seemed imminent, Sviatoslav's forces proved more than capable, and soon it seemed likely that they would break the siege. Tzimiskes panicked and suggested they settle the war by single combat, but Sviatoslav just laughed at him. A few days later, Sviatoslav suggested a prisoner exchange, that the Rus were to be let go with provisions, and that trade between the Rus and Byzantines was to be reopened. Tzimiskes agreed, and the two met for a parley. The meeting was arranged at the bank of the river. Tzimiskes rode there on his horse, whereas Sviatoslav arrived in a boat, rowing together with his men. Though the emperor stepped down from his horse, Sviatoslav remained seated in the boat. A Byzantine observer described the appearance of the king. He was grey-eyed and snub-nosed, with a straggling moustache, wispy beard, and of average height. Dressed only in a white shirt, though cleaner than the others, he didn't look much different from one of his men. However, the fact that he wouldn't stand from the boat showed that he was on equal terms with the emperor, nor that he had surrendered, but offered him equal terms. The rulers agreed to the treaty, and Sviatoslav signed and sealed it. As aforementioned, Sviatoslav's sign was the bident. He would leave this symbol behind in various places to mark them as his property. A few have survived, indicating where he and his warriors would have been. On the eastern edge of the Crimean Peninsula, the bident was carved into the stone wall of a sepulchre, belonging to a Bosporan king. In the Balkans, the bident was discovered in a cave in Basarabi, upon the lower Danube. Though Sviatoslav had failed in his ambition to establish a new Rus upon the Danube, he was still in possession of great amounts of booty collected in his campaigns. Loading them into his boats, he set course once more, back to the city of Kiev. However, his commander, Svenald, advised him to return on horseback instead. You see, the river Dnipro between the city of Kiev and the Black Sea were blocked by the 7 rapids. These could only be circumvented by portage, rendering the boatmen susceptible to attack from the Pechenegs. Though the Pechenegs had been a temporary ally of the Rus, this was not guaranteed after their recent betrayal, and they had now encamped close to the rapids in order to pressure the Rus' commerce. Nonetheless, Sviatoslav refused to heed Svenald's warnings, and perhaps he shouldn't have done so. Svenald was a grey-haired veteran of many conflicts, having seemingly fought the Khazars and Byzantines in the 940s. He had marched upon the Drevlians in 946 and accompanied Sviatoslav throughout his child and adulthood, from Khazaria to Bulgaria. He is truly one of the most fascinating figures from the primary Chronicle, and it is a shame that we do not know more about him. However, Sviatoslav isn't entirely to blame. According to the Byzantines, he was aware of the Pechenegs' position upon the rapids, and of their affiliation with the Byzantines. So he requested safe passage from the emperor, and he acquiesced. Sviatoslav departed by boat, and the people of Pereiaslavets, vengeful against the pagan Sviatoslav and his brutal occupation, sent a message to the Pechenegs. When the king approached the rapids, it became apparent that the Pechenegs had no interest in listening to the Byzantines. Sviatoslav had to stay the winter on the coast of the Black Sea, where his understocked forces were struck by famine. The soldiers would pay half a grivna, a weight of silver, for a horse's head. When spring came, Sviatoslav approached the rapids once more and was attacked by the king of the Pechenegs. Sviatoslav was slain in the ambush. A violent death for a violent man. According to legend, the Pechenegs cut off his head, gilded his skull, and made a drinking cup out of it. Svenald, however, had survived once more. He returned to Kiev and informed Yaropolk, Sviatoslav's successor, that he was now king. However, while Sviatoslav had been the sole heir and inheritor of Igor, Sviatoslav had many sons, all of whom desired their father's throne. There had never been a succession crisis before, and no rules were implemented to handle succession. Though the age of the warlike, nomadic Rus had come to an end, the road to civilization was dark and uncertain. If you want to support Stearman, you can do so monetarily via the Patreon link in the video description. Otherwise, give the video a like and a comment, and if you want to see more videos in the future, subscribe and click the notification bell. And the bell is very important, because YouTube is otherwise reluctant to actually show you the videos. Please enjoy, and I'll see you again soon.